like I might do it at the Old North Burying Ground, okay? I want to introduce you to the growing popular historian of our town of Ipswich, Mr. Gordon Harris, right here.
Oh.
And Gordon is involved in this program. He's going to tell you about it, so let it fly.
Well, before I became the town historian, for a short time I was the chairman of the Historical Commission. And we adopted a project that we always
Historical
do.
Commission.
That's correct.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, the Ipswich Historical
Okay,
Commission.
all right,
The Historical Commission.
all right.
And we adopted this project, restoration of the old burial ground. Well, one of our primary concerns was that the stones age and deteriorate, and how to try to preserve them as best we can.
Okay.
And the other is that, you know, we have a small cemetery crew, and they work really hard at keeping the stuff. I think the cemetery looks pretty good. The grounds look pretty good.
Yeah.
They need a little help. And,
A little spooky, but it's...
well, we like a little spooky.
Oh, yeah.
We like it to have a little interesting, graveyard look. But some of the trees are beginning, the branches are falling off and in danger of breaking stones. This happened a few times.
Okay.
And so what this evolved into was a long-term plan for preserving the cemetery,
Okay.
dealing with things like this asphalt sidewalk, which was put down, I think, maybe in the 1930s or 40s. It's been there that long. And how to deal with invasive growth, especially going up on the hillside. That's the Victorian cemetery up there.
No, I've been up those steps many times. Those steps are a little dangerous.
Well, the
too.
steps, I would advise not to go running up them, especially on a wet day or icy day. But what we're going to focus on here today is the oldest part of the Old North Burial Ground. Now, there on the Historical Commission site, historicipswich.org, and on my site, which is Stories from Ipswich, we have a lot of information about this.
Okay.
There was a book written in 1933 to 35 by the Ipswich Historical Society, which is the museum now.
Okay.
That's not the same thing as the commission,
Okay.
which came later. And they drew a map of the entire burial ground with the names of everybody buried there.
Okay.
And fortunately, a steam town historian, who was a much smarter guy than I am, had written a story of many of these people.
Wow.
So what I want to do here today is take you through maybe a couple dozen
Sure.
of the oldest stones here, and we'll see if we can dig up a few secrets, a few stories from these people.
No bodies. There's no bodies. I'm not going to dig up any bodies. 1634, so it dates from the founding of Ipswich.
This is, yes, it was, Ipswich was actually founded in 1634, and as a matter of fact, John Winthrop Jr., who was the son of the governor,
Was ordered by his old man to go to Agawam, right?
12 brave men to come to Agawam, which was an Indian village, and they actually made a pretty reasonable agreement with the Indians, who needed some help at the time, to live here, and they founded the village 1 year later of Ipswich. They sort of changed the name from Agawam to Ipswich, and then they brought their families.
Okay.
John Winthrop Jr. Led the group. His wife died of childbirth that year,
Oh, really?
and is buried here somewhere. Now, those early graves were marked with wooden crosses or tombstone, wooden markers, and they're gone. So we don't really know where the first grave was. However, a few years ago, a woman's body and with a newborn infant skeleton was supposedly dug up close to that blue house. And
Really?
so there's a possibility that she was buried there, but who knows? We haven't been able to verify that.
Let's get in there.
There's a lot of interesting people here. Come on inside. We'll start here. We'll start here right at the very beginning. This is the Manning tomb. Now, there's quite a number of famous Mannings in the town. Dr. John Manning, whose house still stands, a Federal era house right across from the First Church. He was famous for having driven into Boston right after the Boston Massacre, with all this going on between the Redcoats and the Patriots, and rescued his daughter-in-law, and then went back with medicine and supplies from people of Ipswich, and actually treated soldiers and the fighters of both sides. He was there for a while, and then in Ipswich he started 2 woolen mills. Now, the first one was a really bad idea. He built the windmill right exactly where the spot where the Choke Bridge pub is. And it was a
Really?
kind of a horizontal rotating windmill. It was huge, and it made horrible whirring sounds. Of course, who would build a windmill at the bottom of a hill right next to a river? So it was a bad idea. But he'd seen it in Europe, and he thought, well, maybe it would work here, but he hadn't quite thought it all through. So that was a failure, and fortunately, later on, the building burned down, and now we have the pub.
Okay.
But he did start a new mill.
That's an improvement.
Dr. Manning built the mill out at Willowdale.
Who was Jacob Manning Jr.?
Jacob, well, there was a lot of Mannings, and I don't know who he was.
'Cause that's my house, is the Jacob
Is
Manning
that
Jr.
right? I believe that all the Mannings are related, and there were some of the Mannings in Raleigh. Matter of fact, there's a
This
famous.
my house, the Jacob Manning Jr. house. If you go into the Museum of Fine Arts, I can't remember if I ever told you this.
Yeah.
I'm stumbling through there and I see the Jacob Manning Jr. house. I said, I just struck gold. The Museum of Fine Arts never asked me to put, but it was a house that was on the corner, I think, of
That's
Manning.
right. That's right.
And he built my house behind it.
It was a big timber frame house, and if you go in the MFA, there's a room there with the whole frame of this house. The beams are humongous.
Well, that's what I thought was my house when I went.
Well, as a matter of fact, I think your house is at the museum, and that house is there. I think your house is not at the museum.
Okay,
but that's a different story.
Well, I lived there for 40 years.
But you know these guys were all related. Matter of fact, there's another famous story about the Manning boys who were out clamming and during a storm, and they got kind of washed out to sea and managed to get on top of one of those big haystacks, that was out in the marshes back in the day, and they floated in, and they almost died out there screaming for help, and finally they were rescued. So the Mannings were always up to something.
All right, let's lead on.
All right. Now when you come on into the cemetery here, this guy's name is Benjamin Dutch. Now his house is on County Street, right at the intersection with Summer Street. Still there. It's a nice little blue house.
Okay.
But he owned a lot of houses in this town. This is probably Benjamin Dutch second or third. All the Benjamin Dutches were real estate guys from the very beginning.
Like an old English name.
Yeah.
It is.
And when I look at the deeds of almost every one of these houses from the Essex courts, somewhere in there, Benjamin Dutch bought the house and sold it a very short time earlier on. So
Flipping.
he was a flipper. And he was a wheeler and dealer. As a matter of fact, there was a little controversy when the colonists tried to start their own
What are the
land
dates?
bank, and he was involved in that little controversy as well.
What dates are we
So this
talking
guy, he departed this life in 1760.
Okay.
So I'm guessing he was probably the second or third of Benjamin Dutch. Now, as you move on down through here, these are kind of newer, finer tombstones. We have the Appleton family.
Okay. Well known in town.
Dr. Joseph Manning. This is a fine stone. His house is still on South Main Street. If you cross over the Choate Bridge, on the right, there's one of the storefronts there has a lot of windows with little squares.
Okay.
Now, we used to be right across from the town hall, but in the early 1900s, the old town hall.
Yeah.
In the early 1900s, they built a Ford dealership and a Chevrolet delership, and they moved this building over just a couple of buildings.
Okay.
But it's still there. I think it's the second building down. And one of the funny things about Dr. Manning is when he built this really fine federal house here, he wanted a little bit more land in the backyard. But they had rules for this development. That this is one of the town's first commercial strips, and they were not supposed to let their land go down beyond the high water mark. So he was seen at night to take his rowboat down the river, and he would pick up rocks and just keep enlarging his yard, So the doctors were really storied characters. I have a few more doctor stories along the way. We get into Appletons. We're going to see a lot of Appletons on this little tour here today. These are later Appletons, 1791. And the Appletons, their history, the story of the Appletons, it goes back to the very beginning of this town with Sam Appleton from Little Wallingfield.
Who's the colonel?
Colonel Samuel Appleton, Colonel John Appleton. That's probably the one you're thinking about. Right. His house is right there at the corner of North Main Street.
Are
and
any of them
Street.
buried on the farm?
That I don't know, but a lot of them are buried down at the South Cemetery. This guy, I want to tell you about this guy. This is Elizabeth Farley, Honorable Michael Farley, Major General, right before the Revolutionary War. Michael Farley. He'd been a general. He'd helped defend the town. He'd been a general in the Massachusetts troops.
Yeah.
Highly respected. When the Revolutionary War began, one of the first things they did is they got the services of General Lafayette, and they were very excited about this guy coming from France. I don't know why, but
I'm reading a biography of him. He was a cool dude.
He was a really cool guy. This town was so excited because he came through town, and at the very beginning he came through Ipswich, so everybody came out. And General Farley here, now he was elderly. He was 56 years old. So too old to be fighting anymore, but he comes out. He's the head of the selectmen, and he comes out, and it was a courtesy to bow and lift your hat. Well, when he did, his wig came off with it, and General Farley was so esteemed that the other selectmen went right along with it, and they pulled their wigs off as well. So General Lafayette wrote home to France that the people in Ipswich are rather odd. They have an unusual way of greeting people. And
he was only like 19.
I know,
when he came.
and he actually came back again and visited Ipswich, and they were so excited. It was the two most exciting days in the history of Ipswich, I think, were when General Washington came through, and then when General Lafayette came. Both times, the entire town decorated up and met down at the South Green. Now, to the right here, I believe we have Daniel Noyes. Daniel Noyes also lived in that same house that John Appleton lived at, right across from the Five Corners.
Yeah.
That house actually has a famous story because Texaco was going to knock over the house and build a service station, and it was one of our most famous.
Wow.
Some of our most famous people lived in that house. Daniel Noyes was one of the early school teachers in the town, and then he became the first postmaster in town, and at that time post office began in his home, and eventually that little red building right up there by Dr. John Manning's house. These are Michael Farley and his wife. Now, where it's a patriarchal society, especially in those days, and interestingly enough, the Indians that were here before were more of a matriarchal society. But it is interesting to see that in the burial ground, at least, the women are given a lot of credit, because it takes an even stronger woman to have a strong man. So behind every strong man there's an even stronger woman. Reverend Frisbee came to town, Federal era, so late 1700s.
He didn't invent the.
Not that Frisbee. This is a different spelling. This is Frisbee with an IE. Reverend Frisbee was, of course, the minister at the First Church.
Okay.
He was followed by Reverend David Kimball. Both of their houses still exist. The Kimball house is right behind the First Church. Reverend Frisbee's house is behind it on County Street.
Okay.
And it's a federal building close to where Green Street comes down. Now, it was unfortunate. His daughters, two of his children died soon after he came here. But he stayed as the minister of the church for quite a long time, 30 or 40 years.
This is slightly off the subject. You want an amazing project?
Yeah.
I have made this statement before, that I think the First Church could be the oldest congregational church in its original location.
That could very well
Because
be.
nobody knows where John Winthrop Sr.'s first worship place was in Boston.
Right. Yeah. Now think about that. That is probably the sixth edifice of the First Church.
Yeah, but I'm just saying the same location.
It's on the same location. When John Winthrop Jr. and his guys that came with him came to basically found the town.
Yeah.
They looked for the high spot.
Yeah.
And there it was. Now they didn't want to go up on this hill. That's a little too high. But that high spot was what seemed convenient. It was close to the river.
Yeah.
It's a very rocky spot, so it was clear. They built that First Church had a wall. I believe it was a stone wall around it because they expected to be attacked by Indians. Now we were fortunate in Ipswich that we had a good relationship with the Indians here, but it wasn't true even maybe 30, 40 miles away in New Hampshire, especially out in western Massachusetts.
When was King Philip's? That was the late 60s.
Yeah, that 17th century was a pretty tough time.
Rough.
You had King Philip's War, and then the Andros Rebellion. We had the whole Salem witchcraft thing.
Yeah.
And they're always afraid of the French. As a matter of fact, Ipswich was an outpost for Boston to try to have a bulwark against French inclusion. Let's take a look at another minister's tombstone. This is Reverend.
Some of these got some age. Look at this.
Reverend, they're really old.
Yeah.
You notice on this one, so we don't even know. Our maps will tell us who it is, but these are made of slate. Now you see all the moss growing, but the slate, if you take a look, see the serrations. The slate is layered, especially some of the older slate. Some of the newer slate doesn't layer as much, but the old begin to layer, and then the faces start cracking off. So little places like this here, just touching them or trying to clean them, you have to be very careful.
There's no real way to restore them.
There may be ways that you can laminate some of that surface to try to prevent it from getting any worse.
Okay.
But fortunately, we have the inscriptions. Some of these tombstones where the face has now begun to fall off.
Yeah.
Fortunately, we have the inscriptions that were recorded in 1935 during that project, and so we know what they said. But I would have to look at the map now. I can't even read that anymore.
Yeah.
I want to show you this one. This is Reverend Nathaniel Rogers. The town has had actually a number of ministers at First Church named Rogers. They were the early ministers. There was an early Nathaniel Rogers in the 1600s. This guy came to Ipswich about 1699, 1700, as I recall.
It looks like Ben Franklin.
And in this case, they didn't give him his tombstone the death head. This carver actually carved what they thought he looked like, probably later in life.
Okay.
His house is also still standing. So you know where Ray Morley's bed and breakfast is, right there at the top North Main Street. Right next door to it is a house of peace. It used to be called Ye Burnham's Lodge or Ye Burnham's Place. That house was existing, but they completely redid it and made it into, at that time, a very, very nice house for 1700. And the house was reconstructed especially for this guy here. I'm going to get back into some Appletons for a moment here. We were talking about Samuel Appleton. Now, the Andros Rebellion was one of the things that Ipswich is famous for. When the monarchy was restored after the English Civil War, and the English started looking at the Ipswich and the Massachusetts Bay Colony and said, "Where's all the money? This is supposed to be a profitable endeavor for them, but they weren't getting the money from us." And so they sent a guy named Andros to be the governor. We'd always had our own governor, and we'd always had collected our own taxes. We were self-taxed and self-governed. And suddenly this guy Andros was made governor by King Charles, and we had a rebellion, and Ipswich is known as the birthplace of the American Revolution.
Independence. That's where it comes from.
That's right. Like 80 and 90 years before.
Okay.
Well, this is the body here of Colonel Samuel Appleton, died 1696. Now, what happened on that day was Reverend John Weiss from way down in Essex, which was the town of the parish of Tobacco, part of Ipswich, rode into town on his horse, said, "Look, we got to do something." Now, this guy, Reverend Weiss was famous for not only for being a pretty good minister, but being a pretty good wrestler too. And he's ready to take on the Redcoats early and Andros, and so he got everybody stirred up. John Andrews, town treasurer, I believe, and Samuel Adams, elderly, I suppose, at the time, maybe 60 years old. His son, Appleton, sorry, not Appleton, These guys call a meeting of the town.
Yeah.
Ipswich has sort of a reputation for not liking to be overtaxed. And it's always been true, and it was true then. The entire town unanimously voted not to appoint a tax collector. So Andros sent the soldiers in, and they arrested this guy, Samuel Appleton, and John Appleton Jr. We've talked about where his house was.
I feel like starting a rebellion. I live on the water down the neck. I don't want to tell you about my taxes, but no, I'm sorry.
You're going to be an island anyway, so you can start your own country. Here's the body of that John Appleton, I believe. Now, this is very interesting because I don't know which John Appleton actually it is, but oftentimes there are tombstones were not nearly as pretentious as the magnitude of their lives.
Yeah, that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward, And Samuel, poor little Samuel Appleton here. This is.
Well, he's got a little dressed up though.
This would be Samuel Appleton too. Now, take a look at the almost all of those early tombstones. They have a skull and wings, and so what does this mean? It's, it was sort of like the contrast between the death of the body and then your soul flying away into heaven. So
Did they believe in predestination? No.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think they did.
But they were a little weird in the religion. religion.
You know, there was a big controversy that went on. This guy here, we just took a look at probably the most viewed tombstone, the Reverend Nathaniel Rogers. The other Nathaniel Rogers was sent here to try to straighten things out. There was a big controversy called, I think it was Antimonian, if I pronounced that right, controversy. Anne Hutchinson in Boston.
Okay, yeah.
She was raising hell with him, saying, "Is it works or is it grace?" You know, and actually, you know, a lot of these guys went to Rhode Island, started their own state.
Well, you know, I worked for Boston Duck Tours for 10 years.
Uh-huh.
So actually, we learned a little bit about like Mary Dyer.
Yes. Yeah.
She became a Unitarian.
Yep.
And they were ready to string her up in Boston Common.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Well, you know, we had a Unitarian church here for about 20 years. It was the old town hall was built as a Unitarian church.
Really?
That's right. And it was a single floor.
Okay.
And you know, they had a lot of money coming in. It was a strong movement at the time. But the people in Ipswich, they want to go to the church where they're always gone. So it didn't do so well. And I think it didn't take more than about 20 years. They sold it to the town. And so the old town hall that you see now, the top floor of it was the church. So they used it for a town hall, and then when they needed a bigger town hall, what they did is they actually built a new first floor and put the Unitarian church on top. So that's why the sanctuary part is arranged like that. So. This is another one of the John Appletons, and I believe this may be the other John Appleton that was involved with that whole Andros Rebellion.
Okay.
With his wife, they're buried here together. Unfortunately, it's a great stone, but it's very hard to read in this particular light. Now, John Winthrop Jr. founds the town.
Yeah.
And then his wife dies, and I don't know, things, he just didn't feel right about it. So he went back to England and picked up another wife very quickly. But he came back and he didn't want to stay. The town actually gave him this huge piece of property, which is now known as Crane Castle. They gave it to him. They said, if you'll stay, you can have it. Because that had always been, right from the beginning, they said that was going to be kept by the town for perpetuity. It didn't take long before they broke the promise and they gave it to John Winthrop. Wow. He left town anyway. He ended up in Connecticut. Became, I believe.
Why didn't he go to Boston with his old man?
Well, I think his assignment was to go make new towns.
Okay.
And so he left with his new wife, and he sold the property out there to Governor Simmons, and it went on and on and on to various owners. At one time, it was owned by the Lateman family or the Brown family, etc.
I want to ask you something.
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever heard this, but in the early 70s, Paul McGinley and a couple of these other people, and I was a member of it, we had a group called the Coterie.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
And if you had the old homes, and
Yeah.
we'd have a speaker once a month. And one of them there was a ghost up here, a woman.
Uh-huh.
And she used to sit on one of these.
Oh.
And this might be the one.
Okay.
And people swore up and down that they would see her.
Uh-huh.
And she was never threatening. One story I heard is just sitting here with sort of a white nightgown thing, holding a painting.
I wish I could see that.
A lot of people talk about it. Who knows? But
from a young lady who is a descendant of Daniel Dennison. She said, this was about a year ago, she said, we would like to replace the wording and the emblem on Daniel Dennison's tombstone because it's missing. And so I came up and took a look, and sure enough, this stone was so covered with moss that you couldn't see this. When John Winthrop Jr. left, the town was freaked out because they didn't have a leader anymore. Now, this young man came to Boston with his parents. He's only about 16 years old, highly educated, and with tremendous potential. And the town basically, it was like you're buying a new Major League Baseball player. They wanted this guy,
Yeah.
and they promised him whatever you want. So he came to Ipswich, and he fulfilled every
First
possible.
round draft.
Yes, he was. He fulfilled every expectation.
Yeah.
He became eventually the Major General Daniel Dennison, in charge of the entire military forces of Massachusetts.
What's the emblem? Is that like
Well,
coat of
I believe
arms?
this is the Dennison family crest.
Okay.
The guy was so loved and so honored in this town. He died in 1682, but for at least a couple hundred years after that, the town would have Daniel Dennison days, and there was a Daniel Dennison battalion that would march in the parades.
Yeah.
There was a Dennison school right behind the first church. Now he's mostly forgotten today.
I was just
but he
going to
was
say
the
that
town's
because
greatest
you
leader.
see the name Lord, you see the name Appleton,
Yeah.
Manning. Not sure I've ever heard of this guy.
Well, one of the things about is that the Appletons, have stayed. Matter of fact, we all enjoy going out to Appleton
Yeah.
Farms. That was the estate that was started by Samuel Appleton, the settler, and it grew and grew and grew. And the Lord family up here, you see where the pinnacle is beyond that, there's an entire section there of Lords. There's more Lords in here. These are newer sections.
What are these tombs up here? Are they old or no?
Well, they're, when you get to this, right about here, this is the end of section C, which is the very oldest part.
Okay.
And the tombs were put up probably about, I don't know exact date, but maybe just before they began going up the hillside.
Okay.
And built this, what was once a magnificent Victorian cemetery. It's difficult. It's still interesting, but it's difficult to handle the weed growth.
I can picture it.
This guy, he's famous to me because his story is so interesting. Another doctor. Doctors were pretty quirky guys back in those days. Thomas Berry owned land at the very end of Town Farm Road, which wasn't even called Town Farm Road. It was probably a dirt track.
Okay.
And as you may know, later on the town bought that property and built a town farm. That's where the poor people lived out there for about 100 years or so. And then that was closed in the early 20th century because we found better ways to take care of the elderly and the poor people than putting them away on a farm and putting them to work. Thomas Berry was rather eccentric. He, of course, these people that had the farms out at the end of these roads, like the Appletons, also had their townhouse. So John Appleton had the farm that Samuel Appleton had begun, and he had that wonderful house on North Main Street. And Dr. Berry had a house there about where the funeral home is, the Porter funeral home is now. So he had a chariot, like an Egyptian type of chariot where he would stand, and he had two slaves that would drive. One was a manservant, the other was would drive the chariot, and he would ride through town with this scarlet cape, and people. He was a member of the legislature, or what they call it. He was a town leader. He was a doctor. He was a general. He was everything. People were awed by this guy and afraid of him, and they would actually bow down and to when he went by. If you read this down here, it's in Latin, and I can't pronounce it right, so I'm not going to try. But what you interpret is thus passes the glory of the world. He believes so highly in himself. Now, he must not have been the greatest doctor, because up behind those houses on High Street, going up the hill, so over there used to be some springs, and I suppose they're still there. They probably tapped into them to maybe do the reservoirs or whatever. Yeah. And he got the idea that a cold bath would be very good for you, and he was pushing this concept.
But probably use leeches.
Well,
too.
Unfortunately, these are
his patients.
The tombstones actually his daughters, his first victims. They died of pneumonia or something like that. Now I'll show you. Let's take a look at what may be the oldest tombstone. I have my suspicions about this one. This tiny little stone here.
Oh, wow.
It's marked simply E.L. Now it's in the Lakeman lot. All of these are Lakeman. and there was an Ebenezer Lakeman Early. 1647. There's lots of reasons to believe that this is not original. If it was original, this is probably what's left of it. But it's recorded in the 1935 book by Memento Mori by the Ipswich Historical Society. 1647.
Wow.
And died, it says, age 48, EL. So it appears that if it was original, what they've done is they've remounted it on top of another stone. If it is,
The penny here.
maybe blonde. If it
was a donation.
If it is a 1647 tombstone.
No.
If it is a 1647 tombstone, I think that would make it possibly the oldest one in the state. You have some of these newer ones. This is a great death set here.
Oh man, yeah, the skull and the wings again.
Yeah, that was very common. Another one of the Lakeman family. Of course, we have a Lakeman's Lane and
Yeah.
road out there. But beyond that, in this area here, there's some very, very old stones that we do have recorded the dates of death, but they're small.
Yeah.
But they're quite old. They're early 1700s, most of them. And I suspect that you had the parts where your more wealthy, famous families lived, and probably these people were.
Is that your
were a
family
little
plot?
poor.
I see a Harris up there.
You know what's interesting is I am Harris. I didn't grow up anywhere close to
I
here.
know you didn't. What are these little ones? Are these kids, or are they just...
No, that is actually probably a footstone. This is a
from
footstone.
where the
So
body lies.
the bigger stone would be right here.
Okay.
So, for example, this is a footstone for Aaron Potter, and there's his headstone.
Okay.
So Aaron's lying in there in between.
Yeah.
All right. So
that's-
here you have
I
a stone
see.
that actually, I don't know why it cracked in half, but probably a tree limb fell on it. This is one of the primary concerns that we have about preserving the burial ground. Of course, the stones shift, and if you're careful, you can dig them up and you can get them. They're heavier than you would expect. Even picking up that one piece there probably would give you a
is it?
backache.
Granite? No. What is it?
This one does not. I can't tell if it's slate or what it is, but this is Abraham Perkins.
Okay. Is
Lots
another
and
Ipswich
lots
name?
and lots of
Lots
Perkins,
and
all the
another
Perkins,
Ipswich
a lot of. But it is part of the plan that we will have to have a long-term plan how to deal with the beautiful maple trees. But at the age they are, look at the one here behind us. It's more dead branches than live branches. That one there.
Oh yeah.
Let's go up the hill a little bit. You're asking about the age of these here. It's not what I thought. Middle of the 19th century, 1848 on that one, 1836 on this one.
Newcomers.
Yeah, and then we have the herd mausoleum there, and they are buried inside there. These bodies are lying on platforms, slabs inside, and they're still there. I don't have the key, unfortunately.
No, that's all right. We can skip that.
That one over on the hillside, the last one down is made of brick, and as you can see what's happening is that the earth is starting to push it out, and it's in danger of
No
collapse.
name.
We have recorded, but honestly I don't remember who that one is. This is Thomas Dennis. His house, still standing, first period house, a red house on County Street, just 3 doors down from where East Street hits County Street. Now,
Okay.
Thomas Dennis is one of the most famous wood carvers of colonial America. He came here from England. He learned the cabinetry joinery business, is really what I should call it. Joinery of woodworking had reached a very sophisticated level, with being able to make mortises, to have the tools to be able to plane. Everything was hand worked still, though. All the cabinetry, your faces, everything was joined with mortises and tenons, just like the way they built houses with the big post and beam houses. The technique was similar, just on a different scale. His work was very fine, the Ipswich Museum has one of his pieces. It's in the Whipple House, and there are quite a number of them around. And if you were able to even find one that's for sale, you would have to have at least $10,000 to buy one of his.
That's
one
what
of
we
his
ought to
pieces.
do. Is we ought to do a piece on the Whipple House.
Well, there you go. I think his wife.
Well,
Yep. We don't want
They're getting me, these
we don't
ghosts.
Want, we don't want a
Ghosts.
double burial here. So, Grace Dennis. This is his wife.
yeah.
John Fisk is the chairman of the Historical Commission, and he has a shop just over across the Choate Bridge there on the right.
Uh-huh.
He specializes in, I think it's 17th century furniture, the very same kind of a piece of the work that Thomas Dennis was doing. And he wrote an article for our site about these stones, about this one in particular, because when you look at Thomas Dennis's chest, he often did little rosettes.
Yeah, I
little
noticed
inscriptions
those
like this.
on one or two of the other tombs, did I? Something like that?
Yeah, but there were a number of tombstone engravers or makers, you know, in the 17th century,
You got the skull
18th
and wings
century,
again, right?
and you can often tell. Yes, you can often tell which one it was by the faces. Like, so for this one, for example, it's not a death's head. It's a little round. He almost always did the little round faces.
Okay.
But John believes, and I think this sounds right. This is very, very similar to some of the engravings that Thomas Dennis did on his own cabinetry, and so this tombstone was carved out with a little special flair there. The same way on that one. That's another one of the features that you would have found on some of his cabinets. So, you know, the carver emulated that. There's a little mystery about this walkway. It's been here. It's in that map from 1935. Let's go. So the little mystery about this, where are the graves, right?
Yeah.
So there's no graves in here. You know, could it be that from the very beginning they had a path? It's actually, there was a legend, there was a belief that was passed on, and there's probably some truth to it, that in the winter when people would die, they couldn't dig the ground, and so they had to put the bodies somewhere. Now, as we know, some places they would, I'm told they would basically hang you up in the barn alongside the slabs of meat, and then they would get around to you later on in the season. But what was said to have happened is here in the middle that they kept sand, and that some of the bodies were temporarily laid onto the sand in the winter, and then they would be buried properly. So whether that's true or not, I don't know. But an interesting thing is that even though this section C is the very oldest part, and then you have section D, a little bit older, I mean not quite as old, this is fairly new, mostly 19th century. But there's a few graves here that really belong in section C. You can see here's one that's old right here.
On the D32.
Yeah, see, I don't know if that might have been laid down there. You ever been to the Hart House, so-called 1640 Hart House?
I worked at the Hart House.
Did you work there?
Yes.
Well,
My bachelor's party was there.
a couple of things about the place. One is that we're pretty sure it doesn't date back to 1640. Thomas Hart, the original Thomas Hart, early settler, did build a house there, but we believe that the house that's there now is just a little bit later, maybe 1670 or so, built by Thomas Hart Jr.
You're breaking my heart telling me this.
But maybe he used some of the same boards.
There's a ghost there too, you know.
I've heard.
That's been validated,
That
supposedly.
there's a couple of rooms there. There's several old rooms. The keeper's room is you go around down. You have to go
Down,
down,
yeah, okay.
and the room above it. Those two rooms are actually not the original rooms. The keeper's room, I think it's in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It was completely removed, and then the room you see, which looks so old, is an exact replica.
Part of it is at the Winterthorpe Museum.
That's the upstairs
somewhere.
part, I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
we're there one night, and this couple is walking around, and I go over to them at the request of the owner and say, "Excuse me, can I help you with anything?
Yeah.
I don't know much about this." Oh, she says, "Oh, don't worry. I'm the assistant curator of the Winterthorpe. I have the original. I just
Yes, he
wanted to
does.
see what the copy was." I said, "Oh my goodness."
It's good.
You know? Yeah,
It's good.
yeah, but that was wild.
Yeah,
you know?
it's amazing. Well, here we are. Here's the Harts. This is Alice Hart.
Why would somebody be leaving flowers?
Well, maybe they like the Hart House. Who knows? But seems to always be flowers here.
Really?
Yeah. So we have Thomas Hart back here. This all these are the Harts.
Wasn't there a rumor that somebody was buried in the basement of the Hart house? Have you ever heard something about that?
I don't know that one, but I can tell you another one.
Yeah.
I think we skipped this. Colonel Francis Wainwright.
Okay.
His house was called the Old Brick. It was a brick house, very unusual for Ipswich, and it was located right where Ray Morley's parking lot there is for the Ipswich Bed and Breakfast.
Oh, wow.
Now it was taken down. I think another brick house was actually built there, and then that was actually taken down too.
Was
Later
that a show
on.
of wealth? I mean, having a brick house? Or
Well,
was
it probably was. No, we had brickyards here.
Yeah.
Heartbreak Hill. That's actually not what it originally was. It originally was called Hard Brick Hill because that whole hill is made out of clay.
Until the Indian maiden died.
Well, that was
Come on, that's a great story.
A nice story. We'll stick with it just because it's so romantic. This woman's name is Hazelponia.
Whoa, that's a handle.
Well,
The people in Ipswich called her Hazel Pony. So it was actually Hazelponia, and it was a name, a sister of one of the people listed in the Book of Judah in the Bible.
Really?
And so Hazelponia grew up in New Hampshire somewhere. Her father became very poor. She was put out as a servant, eventually married. Her husband died, and then she remarried. She went to Boston. She married a man who also died at sea, and then somehow she met a guy named I think it was John Wood here in Ipswich. Now she'd already had a number of children. Some of them were grown up. She brought a couple of her children with her, and John Wood already had 10 children, and she and John Wood had 10 children more. So in her lifetime, she was the mother of 22 children.
Good grief.
And
listen, I want to ask you.
yeah.
That it's not the skull again. It's like the other one.
I would
is
bet
it the same guy?
I bet it's the same
and
guy.
It's got
'cause
those
that
same
exact same
up in the
face.
corners there.
Yeah. John Harris. Well, John Harris was the sheriff during the Salem witchcraft trial, and our ministers in the town really were quite outspoken against this whole thing, but we were pretty helpless against what was going on with the state and with Salem, and so they ran out of room in the Salem jails, and a lot of the accused witches were kept in the Ipswich jail, which is a pretty horrendous place. And the sheriff, John Harris, whose house was actually his son John Jr.'s house, is the ones there on East Street.
Wow.
It was his responsibility to transport these poor accused women, chained to a cart to Salem for trial. That were killed in the shipwreck of the Falconer. Now the Falconer, they hit the Ipswich, the sandbar off of Crane Beach, about 2 miles down the beach from where Crane Beach is now. Yeah. And it was a tragic thing. I was reading the story again just the other day that so many people from the town came out wanting to help to see what was going on. And so they're standing out there on the beach, and they're looking at the ship. That's the Ipswich bar kind of extends way out there. And it was out
I've
there.
run aground out there a few times.
It's stuck on the bar, and taking on water, and the water's absolutely freezing, probably below zero. And people who jumped to try just disappeared into the water, never to be seen. So a number of people are still floating around out there, I suppose.
Well, listen,
Quite
we
a number of
gotta
these.
pack it in.
All right.
I thank you.
That was
And
fun.
Gordon might very well become a fixture on this show, but I think we got to come up with some ghosts.
If you can prove a few ghost stories.
What
that'd
the
be great.
heck?
That's good. Well, we have a story. We have lots of stories about ghosts. So
Later.
We'll work on it.
You go
All
over to
right.
the metery.
Well, thanks for letting me do this. That was fun.
It's our pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
have seen the dark shadows moving in the woods, and I have no doubt that whatever I have resurrected through this book is sure to come calling for me.